So now that we've built the base joints for this head, we're going to go ahead and create a smooth skin for this. So at this point we have our lower jaw and lip, head, upper jaw and lip, our left and right ear joints, as well as various head pivots. We also need to remember that we have the body rig in here as well. And we're going to use the chest joint as well as the neck ribbon joints in addition in this skin here. So we'll start by selecting the mesh. Shift selecting the chest joint, the 3 neck ribbon joints. Open up the hypergraph for this next part and then start selecting the head joints here. So this base pivot back here, all of the upper jaw and lips, the lower jaw and lips, the left and right ear joints. Once again, they're all labeled J and T. I'm going to activate the smooth bind by selecting skin, bind skin, smooth bind. Let's open the option box. I'll reset this quickly. Talk about some of these options. So the first option is bind to, and the default is joint hierarchy. And what that would do with the joints that we have selected, it would bind to every joint in that hierarchy. But we went through here and selected specific joints, so there's a second option here, which is selected joints, which allows us to bind only to the joints we have selected. And I prefer using this method since in a rig I'll often have joints that are in the rig and in the hierarchy but not intended for binding. A third option is object hierarchy, which is identical to joint hierarchy. You can have a series of objects, polygonal and NURBS objects, as well as locators that you can use in the initial smooth bind. That's a relatively new feature. But we're going to stick with the selected joints. The next bind method defaults to closest in hierarchy. What that means is when each CV or vertex is looking for an influence, here it biases it toward whatever influence is next in the hierarchy of joints within the influence radius. The second option is closest distance, which I prefer since the closest influence may not necessarily be the closest in hierarchy order. So we'll base it on distance, whichever influence is closest to the vertex in this case. The max influences specifies the maximum number of joints or objects that will be included in the initial bind of the skin cluster. I'm going to set this to 3. Next we have after bind, maintain max influences. If you're working in a video game environment where a vertex can have a limited number, a defined and fixed number of influences per vertex, then this can be a useful option. It will make sure that you never go beyond that limit of maximum influences. But in any other environment, feature animation or visual effects, I would recommend disabling that since you don't want to be limited with the number of influences that you can use to drive a given CV or vertex. So I'll disable that. Next we have drop-off rate, which in Maya units will say for any given vertex based on the maximum influences. This gives a maximum range that each CV or vertex will reach out and look for a given influence. In this case it's 4 units. We'll just leave that at default. Next we have remove unused influences. So based on these two parameters, max influences and drop-off rate, if there are any influences that are selected but outside of these combined ranges, it will prune those from the skin cluster. So it's an automatic optimization pass. I'll disable that. And lastly, we have colorize skeleton, which assigns colors to each of the joints. And then you can judge the influences of the joints, or the weights of the joints on the CVs and vertices by their color. So for instance, if you had one joint that was yellow and the adjacent joint that was green, you'd have a mix of those colors, and depending upon how yellow or how green or blue it was, for instance, you would get a mix of green, and it will give you an indication of the amount of weight of each of the influences. So for this example, we'll turn that off and click Bind Skin. When we select our mesh, we have a new skin cluster. I'll quickly rename this. Also have a range of motion animation. There's the lower jaw, upper jaw, and then they swing out in opposite directions before closing. Have the chin, upper and lower lips, in and out. Then the base head pivot, the ears in all the directions. This is basically all the joints being moved in this rig. Once again, this is default bind, but that range of motion we can just sort of scroll through and see which areas we need to edit, as well as go in and edit those weights without having to constantly rotate joints and then zero them back out again. We just animate all of them. Okay, so you can see we have quite a bit of work here. This is a good starting point. And so that's our smooth bind of this head, and then next we'll go in and start editing this the smooth skin weights, starting with very rough, 100%, 50% weighting, just blocking out influences, and then we'll go in and further refine specific areas, just to show you the process that I use in weighting the influences on this head.